We're going to talk about olive oil for about half an hour. And, I'm sure you have a range of olive oils in your store, from mild to robust, piquant ones, mellow ones.
Right.
What do you say to your customers about why they might want to have more than one oil?
Having more than one oil is necessary because not oils do exactly the same thing. I've often said that a well-stocked kitchen, and if you've got a well-stocked kitchen, why don't you have a minimum of 3 oils, like a light oil, a medium intensity oil, and a robust oil? But that seems to be a little bit too difficult for people to actually get a hold of. They say, but olive oil is olive oil. I just want one good one. Okay, then I simply say, well, if you want one good one, what are you going to use it for? And they say, oh, for dipping bread. Okay, then you don't want a mild oil. You probably want a medium oil or a robust oil, because we don't look at olive oil as a fat, which it should be. And we look at it normally as a condiment, not a flavoring. And I think the biggest part of getting Americans interested in olive oil is to tell them it's another flavor.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, there are 2 things. One is, for example, we rarely think of olive oil as a condiment for poached fish, because we really don't do a lot of poaching of anything in the United States. On the other hand, boiled beef, poached fish, boiled chicken, those are all dishes which benefit from the sort of zip in flavor that you get when you add an appropriate olive oil. And if you say, well, I just want one oil, it's not going to be probably the appropriate one. I remember in the 60s, probably in 69 or so, one of the magazines, I think it was the food magazine that became Bon Appetit, they actually did an article with Marcella Hazan, the Italian food expert, and they made her use Italian extra virgin oil. And the only dish that was actually liked was when it was served as or with a cooked pasta with a tomato sauce, because when they tried making mayonnaise with it, the mayonnaise turned out being gray, and the taste was the taste of this very bitter oil. So obviously they actually wrote about it and said this was something that we probably shouldn't use extra virgin olive oil for. On the other hand, that's what makes olive oil, makes mayonnaise really very good, is when you use really good olive oil.
In your own home, how do you handle this range of oils? When do you use the milder oils? When do you use the stronger and even the really, piquant, peppery oils? Can you give some examples?
When we at home, I use oils. I mean, there's a standard tin of oil. It's an Arbequina oil from Spain. There is a slightly fuller bodied, still a medium oil, probably from Tuscany or also from the southern part of Spain. But I have a bad answer for you. All of the samples go home. So there's a plethora of oil samples. I can tell you that sometimes if you use the wrong oil, you ruin the dish. when we first started doing courses in olive oil making at UC Davis, we had various people come and talk about production of oil and what they thought oil should be. Italians, Spaniards. The most interesting thing is that they all agreed that a blandish type food, especially something like a cooked legume, cannellini beans, borlotti beans, would need an oil that's a medium to a robust oil in order to give the dish some oomph. A dish of lentils, for example, something as simple for the summertime as a lentil salad is not going to be particularly interesting unless there's some relief to the sort of bland flavor of earthy flavor of lentils. In order to contrast that, you have to use a fuller, medium-bodied or medium pungency oil or a really robust oil to give it some kick. On the other hand, if you make a salad, which is a wonderful summer salad, which is made out of watermelon and feta cheese, which is a Greek salad, you can never use a very robust oil because then that's all you taste. The taste of watermelon is a fairly delicate taste. I did that one time last year at home because there was for one of the very few times, there were not a lot of oils on the counter. And I used an oil that was a very pungent oil. All you could taste was the pungency of the oil. So it's a question which then goes to another subject. How do you learn this? Like you learn how to ride a bicycle, you do it. So, you have to make the ascent of faith that you buy more than one olive oil type. You ask your well-stocked store, I want a mild oil and a medium oil and a robust oil. They should be able to accommodate you with that. If they do, that's in fact the kind of trial that you have to do. You make a cucumber salad, not with a mild oil, but with a medium intense oil or an intense oil. Otherwise, there's no flavor because the cucumber flavor is what's very dominant. So you want to be able to sort of mesh everything. It's actually very simple. On the other hand, people think, well, all I want to do is this, and they don't see the whole panoply of what could be done. There are certain dishes that you need to have a range of oils for. Think of tomatoes and mozzarella. So now you've got a caprese salad. What kind of oil are you going to put on your caprese salad? If you put a mild oil, all you're doing is making it oily. If you put a medium oil or an intense oil in flavor, you're actually giving two things flavor. One is the mozzarella, which has very little flavor. It's supposed to be that way. And the other one is the tomato, which when we use tomatoes, we want very ripe tomatoes. In Italy, it's not necessarily a very ripe tomato, it's a sort of getting ripe tomato because they like the crunchiness of tomatoes. So then you have to balance it out with fruitiness of the oil, which is going to be the flavor, and the pepperiness of the oil, the picante of the oil, which actually acts as the flavor moderator. It's I'm rather disappointed in some respects with American consumers who say, well, I only want one oil. Okay, well, that means you only want one wine. What kind of wine do you want? How are you going to drink this wine for the rest of your life? Tastes change. Your tastes change. Your tastes change according to the weather. In the middle of winter, you're not going to put a very light oil on a hearty dish. For example, a ribollita. You're going to use a fairly pungent oil because bread soup made with vegetables needs to have some kind of lift. You have to think of it as using pepper. You can't use pepper all the time. And then what kind of pepper? White pepper, black pepper, chili pepper. It really depends. So people who are interested in cooking actually have to recognize that olive oil is an ingredient. We don't drink olive oil. Maybe we should drink more olive oil, but Americans, you can't, to get them to think of the idea of taking a teaspoon of oil first thing in the morning sort of turns them off. And yet it probably would be very good for our health if we did something like that. And it's called getting people used to things. 20 years ago, when I first started doing this olive oil stuff with Davis and Paul Vossen, who was the extension agent in Sonoma, there was much less interest in olive oil. People were doing it well because it's something to do instead of make wine. Okay. On the other hand, the product is also a different kind of product. And the product exists because of both the cultivar, the time of harvest, the kind of harvest. Right now, the French, for example, who have a very interesting attitude toward all kinds of food, have created an appellation of origin for the oils from Provence because the government was forced to, because normally the oils of the south of France, the olives are stocked in baskets until they're several weeks old. They start to get very soft, and they make a very special kind of oil. They do not make extra virgin oil for the most part. The oil is virgin oil, but it has a serious defect for most people who taste olive oil because it tastes slightly rancid, or it tastes what we call fusty, which is the smell of a closed room. And it's very curious because the French adore that kind of oil. They say, this is real olive oil. Well, the Greeks had the same taste pattern. And as soon as you begin to show even the natives of a certain country, which is known for its olive oil, they begin to see, well, maybe there can be a difference in oil. And I think we may have taken this a little bit too far because even people who judge oils on how green, and bitter, and pungent they are. Since I'm the chairman of the oil tasting at the Los Angeles County Fair, it's very interesting because I used to call the oils 1, 2, or 3 cough oils. And no matter who you are, even a very expert taster, if the oil slips down your throat a little bit, you cough because that's the reaction to the beneficent part of oil, to the oleoeuropein. And it has taken Americans about 20 years to get that through their heads. Because I remember when we first started importing Tuscan extra virgin oil, people would say, but the acidity is so high. I said, no, there is no acidity. The acidity is very low. And they said, but then why does it make me cough and burn in my mouth? I said, because that's the good part of olive oil, of extra virgin olive oil. And then you simply ask them the follow-up question, have you ever eaten a raw olive? And most people will look at you and say, yes, I tried it once. I said, that's the only time you try it is once. That's the taste of olive oil. I mean, if we keep harping on this thing that olive oil is a fruit juice, maybe we shouldn't. Because when we think of fruit, we think of something sweet. Olive oil is, if anything, not sweet, but it is pungent and bitter.
You have brought up so many interesting points that I want to dive into a little deeper. For one, you compared olive oil to wine. That nobody would ever want to drink the same wine every day. What can you say to chefs who take a lot of care with their wine list but don't think very much about their olive oil selection? What would you say to them to change their mind?
Chefs and restaurants in general and olive oil are a little bit problematic. I really can't answer the question directly, otherwise I will be persona non grata in the restaurant world. Restaurants probably don't need to have a lot of different oils, but they probably should have some oils, especially if they're oils from their region. In California, we've got different olive varieties that do the same thing as olive varieties do in Europe or in the rest of the world. They produce different oils. If a chef is going to say, well, I need an oil for, as I said, a caprese salad, that's one kind of oil. If I need an oil for sautéing, that's another kind of oil. The Italians actually look at olive oil and say these very intense, piquant oils should be used for roasting meat. And then you ask them, well, why? Well, because the normal Italian way of roasting a piece of beef is to put it with some cloves of garlic and a couple of sprigs of rosemary. Those are things that have very strong tastes. You need a fat to actually have the same strength of flavor. As I said, since we don't do a lot of poaching, if you made a salad using things like Israeli couscous, for example, and you made it with shellfish like shrimp, it would be better that you use an oil that had flavor, so a medium intensity to a robust intensity oil, rather than a light oil. And most chefs like to use light oils because it doesn't bother the flavor. But here you're not using the oil as a medium. I mean, they probably would not like to boil or to poach a fish in water when they'd make a court bouillon. Okay, the oil is going to do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, you hit on a really different way of thinking about oil, I think, between Americans and people who come from oil-producing countries. Americans tend to think about just using as little as possible in the skillet to keep something from sticking, just a few drops on the end as a drizzle. But in Mediterranean, it's much different, isn't it, how people use and think about olive oil?
It's very different. I mean, look at, it's now summertime. It's June. Look at the possibility of using oil with raw vegetables. The Tuscan pinzimonio is made for the summer. On the other hand, you need a medium or a robust oil in order to give the vegetables that you're going to be eating raw, to give them some flavor. Otherwise, you're merely anointing the vegetables. You're not flavoring the vegetables. And since they're raw, they have their own flavor. If you want them to taste slightly like something else, then you've got to give them a different experience with a different oil. Something like gazpacho, made with bland oil, is going to just taste oily. Made with an oil that's got flavor to it, either a robust oil or an intense medium flavored oil, you're going to actually have some flavor, some spiciness, so that cleansing green taste.
Do you feel like olive oil can be a real helper as we try to move towards more plant-based eating?
Olive oil and plant-based foods are made for each other. You know, if you're going to say, well, I don't want to use a lot of animal protein or animal fat in a dish, you need to use, or you need to have, a whole series of olive oils. As I said, just something as simple as cooked cannellini beans drizzled with a robust oil actually makes the cannellini beans taste really good. Otherwise, they're just beans.
You mentioned that customers often don't appreciate the pungent oils as much as they might. Can you talk about how we can, chefs and retailers can help people appreciate those oils more?
We can appreciate more pungent oils. And as I said before, I think we're tending to emphasize this style of oil perhaps a little bit too much. Everyone is picking olives very early. And that's what gives the oil its great pungency. But I think if we begin to see that, yes, but oils also change when you cook with them. I mean, for me, a very favorite dish is to make fried eggs using a very robust oil. For a lot of people, it has a negative aspect because the cooked whites turn slightly gray, but they taste terrific. If you don't want to have that character, then you've got to use another oil, because olive oil fried eggs are really delicious. And they're very helpful for you. I mean, you've got a British fry up for breakfast, you can use olive oil fried eggs instead of pork-based fried eggs.
How can a consumer or a chef get the most impact out of the money that they spend on olive oil, which can be very expensive? How do you maximize the impact of what the money you're spending?
The question of the price of oil and its use, especially in restaurants, is again a bit of a conundrum for me. We don't think anything of spending $100, $150 on a bottle of wine. It can be drunk by 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people. A bottle of oil at, say, $40, $50, which is today a relatively reasonable price for olive oil. I won't even go into the picking costs or anything like that, because if you've tried to pick olive fruit once, you only do it once, and then you respect the oil far more. The biggest problem is that everyone looks at it as the expense for a bottle. But it's a bottle that can be used over probably a month's time. It's not a one bottle, one job. It's one bottle, maybe 50 jobs. And I think restaurants especially are a little bit too much, how should I say, they're a little too thrifty, not to say cheap. When they say, oh no, we want to pay as little as possible for olive oil. Okay, but that's very short-sighted. What do you use? Maybe 2 tablespoons of oil in a dish? A bottle of olive oil, which is a 750 milliliter bottle, has 24 ounces. There are lots of tablespoons in 1 ounce of oil. And this sort of idea of, well, it makes the food costs go up. I think they're using bad arithmetic myself. I mean, it's just like using good, very mature wines like Madeira or sherry in cooking. The higher the quality, the less you have to use, the better the results, because the flavor is still there. And I think the same thing goes for the use of olive oil, so that the higher the quality of the oil, the less you use, the customer is actually happier. On the other hand, the customer also has to learn that what they do with the end of the oil on their plate is sop it up with bread. I'm sort of dismayed when I see restaurants, not so much now anymore, but maybe 5 or 6 years ago. As soon as you sat down in a restaurant, they'd bring you a little bowl with oil in it, and then they'd put vinegar in it. We don't eat oil like that, or very seldom do we eat oil like that. In fact, the old Tuscan idea of dressing a dish with oil was depending on the kind of dish and what feast day it was. Because you either put a sea of oil like that, or you put a circle of oil, or you put a figure 8, which was 2 circles. So depending on how luxurious you wanted the dish to be, that's the amount of oil you put on it. If you were very poor, it was only a C. A little bit better off, a circle. Really fancy, an 8.
What a great observation. I was looking at a menu of a very high-end restaurant in Spain just this morning, and I noticed that the chef had on the menu called out the region the oil came from, the olive variety. I've never seen that on a restaurant menu. Can you imagine that becoming commonplace? Would you think that's a good thing for chefs to think about doing?
The use of olive oil as part of the ingredient of a dish is extraordinarily important. I mean, as I said before, if you're in California, the traditional oil for California would be to use something like Mission. Mission is very pungent. So you have to actually be aware of what kind of dish you're going to put the Mission oil with. But that's how oil should be used in a restaurant, is the varietal and why, and especially if it's close to home.
Any final comments, Darrell, that you'd like to share with chefs about olive oil and how you think they could be more thoughtful about it, perhaps?
I think chefs in particular need to think a little bit more about olive oil and not just its presumed cost. They have to think of it as another ingredient in a dish. And even homeowners or homemakers have to do exactly the same thing. Enough with this, all I need is one oil. I just want one oil. That's laziness. I mean, you don't cook with one spice. You have a whole spice rack. Well, I'm not saying that you have to have a whole spice rack of olive oils, but a minimum of 3 would be, I think, the minimum. On the other hand, if you say, well, I only want one oil, okay, here's one that's light, here's one that's medium, here's one that's robust.